Hey guys, welcome back. Grab your blanket, maybe a cup of something warm, and let your eyes get heavy, because tonight we're drifting through several centuries of royal decision-making so bad it deserves its own museum wing. We're talking about the Habsburgs. Dim the lights if you've got them. Turn your phone brightness down. Tonight we begin with a family so obsessed with keeping power in the family that they, well, kept it in the family. Literally, get comfortable. This one's a slow float through castles, cousins, and chins. Lots of chins, so let's start at the beginning, because every good, slow bedtime story needs a beginning, and this one starts somewhere quiet, in the hills of what's now Switzerland, around the 11th century. There's a little castle there called Habsburg, which just means Hawk Castle, which is a pretty good name for a family that was about to spend the next 800 years circling Europe looking for thrones to land on. Nothing dramatic happens yet, just a minor noble family doing minor noble things, slowly figuring out that marriage was cheaper than war. And once they figured that out, they never really stopped. By the late 1200s, a fellow named Rudolf I manages to get himself elected king of the Romans, which sounds impressive and honestly kind of was for the time. This was the gateway job. Once you had that title, your family had a foothold in the whole tangled mess of the Holy Roman Empire, which, fun fact, was not holy, not Roman, and only loosely an empire, but that's a tangent for another sleepy night. Rudolf wasn't flashy, he was practical. He picked up Austria almost as a side project, the way you might grab a second cart at the grocery store because the first one has a wobbly wheel. And just like that, the Habsburgs had a home base, Austria. They would hang on to that for over 600 years, which is longer than most countries have existed, let alone families. Now, here's where it gets slow and interesting, because the Habsburgs weren't really conquerors. They weren't out there charging into battle waving swords and yelling dramatically, although I'm sure a few of them tried that at some point and immediately regretted it. Their real weapon was the wedding ring. There's actually a little Latin phrase people used about them: let others wage war, but you, happy Austria, marry, belligerent alii tu felix Austria nube, which is basically the family motto if families had mottos printed on throw pillows. And they took it seriously, extremely seriously, almost concerningly seriously, as we'll get to. Let's float forward a bit, past a few generations of fairly forgettable dukes doing duke things, until we land on Maximilian I, who shows up around the late 1400s and is honestly one of the more entertaining Habsburgs, in a low-key, exhausted himself kind of way. Maximilian marries Mary of Burgundy, and through that one marriage, the family suddenly inherits the Netherlands, Belgium, and a big chunk of eastern France. One wedding, that's it, no armies. Just a nice ceremony, and suddenly you're the landlord of half of Western Europe. Maximilian apparently loved this strategy so much that he arranged marriages for basically everyone in his family, like a matchmaking uncle who will not stop meddling at Thanksgiving. His son marries into Spain. His grandchildren marry into Hungary and Bohemia. Within about 2 generations, the Habsburgs go from nice little Alpine family to we sort of own most of the map now, and they did it all sitting down at the dinner table with a priest and some wine. This is where things start getting a little goofy, in that dry, understated way history sometimes is. Because when you marry that many cousins into that many crowns, the gene pool starts looking less like a pool and more like a very small, very still pond. And nowhere is that more obvious than in the face of the family. I'm talking, of course, about the Habsburg jaw. If you've ever looked at a portrait of a Habsburg and thought, that's a lot of jaw for one face, you're not wrong, and you're not the first to notice. It's a real documented thing. A pronounced lower jaw, sometimes so pronounced the person couldn't fully close their mouth, which, if you think about it, makes eating soup a genuine athletic event. Doctors and geneticists have actually studied portraits of this family for the specific purpose of measuring how the jaw got worse over time. And yes, it did get worse over time because the family kept marrying itself generation after generation, like a snake, very slowly, very patiently, trying to eat its own tail. Maximilian, to his credit, had a relatively mild version of it. Just wait, though. We're going to watch this thing slowly take over an entire dynasty's face like a very persistent houseguest. Let's drift over to Spain for a bit, because this is where the story really starts to simmer. Maximilian's son, Philip the Handsome, gets married off to Joanna of Castile, who would later be known, not very kindly, as Joanna the Mad. And I want to pause here, because Joanna's story is one of those quiet tragedies that history sort of shrugs at, and I think she deserves a gentler telling. Joanna was, by most accounts, deeply intelligent, multilingual, and emotionally intense, which in a royal court run by men was apparently enough to get you labeled unstable. She fell in love with Philip hard, the kind of love that doesn't leave much room for anything else. Philip, meanwhile, was called the Handsome, and to be fair, contemporary accounts do describe him as good-looking, athletic, charming at parties. He was also, by most accounts, not particularly faithful and not particularly kind about it. Joanna apparently took this hard, really hard. There are stories, some more reliable than others, of jealous outbursts, of her having a rival's hair cut off, of long silences and long tears. Whether she was genuinely mentally ill, or just a deeply passionate woman being gaslit by an entire political system that benefited from calling her crazy so the men around her could rule in her place, is something historians still gently argue about, in the quiet, academic way historians argue about things. Here's the saddest bit, and I promise I'll say it softly. When Philip died suddenly, quite young, Joanna reportedly refused to be separated from his body for a long time. She had it kept near her. Some accounts, though later embellished for dramatic effect by people who really wanted a good ghost story, claim she traveled with the coffin for months. The truth is probably less theatrical and more heartbreaking. A young widow grieving deeply in a political environment that had every incentive to paint her as unstable so her father and later her son could take the reins. And take the reins they did. Joanna spent most of the rest of her long life essentially locked away in a convent at Tordesillas, technically still Queen of Castile, practically a prisoner in her own kingdom, for around 50 years. 50 years. That's not a footnote, that's most of a life. She'd occasionally show flashes of her old sharpness in letters and conversations recorded by visitors, which makes you wonder how much of the mad was actually just the inconvenient. Let's float over to another royal disaster, because that's sort of the shape of this whole story, isn't it? One quiet tragedy drifting gently into the next. Joanna and Philip's son, in a plot twist that surprises absolutely nobody who's been paying attention, becomes Charles V, and he inherits an almost cartoonishly enormous pile of territory. Spain, Austria, the Netherlands, parts of Italy, plus the whole complicated Holy Roman Emperor title on top. He becomes, arguably, the most powerful man in Europe, ruling over an empire so sprawling that people genuinely said the sun never set on it. Which sure, great for the map. Less great for the man himself, who by most accounts spent much of his reign exhausted, gout-ridden, and just generally worn down by the sheer administrative weight of owning that much of the world. He had the family jaw too, by the way, slightly worse than his father's. Contemporary reports mention him having trouble chewing, and there's a famous, slightly grim little detail that he was advised to keep his mouth open at rest, because otherwise saliva would just sort of pool, since his jaw didn't quite close right. Not glamorous. Very human, though. Powerful men with strange, undignified physical quirks are somehow always the most comforting part of history to me, and I hope you're finding it soothing too, because we've got a long way to drift yet. Charles eventually did something fairly unusual for a monarch of his stature. He got tired, genuinely, quietly tired. In 1556, he abdicated, split his empire between his son Philip and his brother Ferdinand, and retired to a monastery in Spain, where he reportedly spent his final days fiddling with clocks, a hobby he apparently found soothing, which honestly relatable. There's a nice little myth, probably not true but too charming not to mention, that he once tried to get a room full of clocks to all chime in perfect unison and gave up, remarking that if he couldn't even get identical clocks to agree, how foolish he'd been to think he could get all his different kingdoms and religions to agree either. A tidy little parable, whether or not it actually happened. This split, by the way, is the moment the family divides into two branches, the Austrian Habsburgs and the Spanish Habsburgs, and both branches, in the grand family tradition, continue the exact same strategy of marrying their own relatives to keep the wealth and power consolidated. Neither branch, it turns out, learns anything from watching the other one do it. Which brings us slowly, gently, like a boat drifting toward a very specific, very sad waterfall, to the Spanish line, and to the man who represents the absolute end point of this whole experiment. Charles II of Spain. Let's take a breath here. Get comfy. This part of the story isn't dramatic so much as it is quietly devastating, in the way looking at old, faded photographs can be quietly devastating. Because Charles II is really the punchline, if you can call a suffering human being a punchline, of about 200 years of the Habsburgs marrying uncles to nieces and first cousins to first cousins over and over, generation after generation, apparently under the belief that this was somehow a safer bet than marrying literally anyone else in Europe. Charles II was born in 1661. His parents were Philip IV of Spain and Mariana of Austria. And here's the detail that always gets people gently right in the oh no spot. Mariana wasn't just Philip's wife, she was also his niece, his full actual blood niece. Philip's sister was Mariana's mother, so when Charles II was born, his family tree wasn't really shaped like a tree at all. It was shaped more like a very small, tightly wound circle, the kind you'd draw if someone asked you to sketch inbreeding, and you didn't want to be too on the nose about it. Geneticists who have studied the Spanish Habsburg genealogy have actually calculated something called an inbreeding coefficient for Charles, and it comes out close to the level you'd expect from a child of siblings, even though, technically, on paper, no two siblings ever married each other in his direct lineage. It just didn't need to happen directly, because it had been happening quietly for generations before him, uncle marrying niece, first cousin marrying first cousin over and over, each time telling themselves this was the safe, sensible, dynasty-preserving choice. And Charles paid for all of it in his own small, quiet body. He was, by every account we have, a deeply unwell child from birth. He didn't walk until he was around 4 years old. He didn't speak until he was about 4 as well. He was slow to develop in almost every way a child can be slow to develop, and the people around him, court physicians who were doing their genuine best with the medical understanding of the 17th century, had absolutely no framework for what they were looking at. they didn't have genetics. They had leeches and prayers and a deep, comforting belief that maybe this was just what happens sometimes, bad luck, God's will. Nothing anyone could have done differently. Certainly nothing to do with, say, marrying uncles to nieces for 2 straight centuries. Physically, Charles had the family jaw taken to what might be its absolute peak expression. Historians, and more recently, actual physical anthropologists using facial reconstruction techniques on his portraits, describe his jaw as so pronounced that his teeth didn't meet properly, which made chewing food genuinely difficult for him for his entire life. He reportedly drooled quite a bit as an adult, simply because his mouth didn't close the way ours does. He also had a large tongue relative to his mouth, which combined with the jaw issue to make his speech slurred and hard to understand, which, in a royal court, is a rough position to be in, because everyone around you is trying to read your every word for policy implications, and you can barely get the words out clearly in the first place. He was sickly constantly, chronic digestive problems. What sound from descriptions like possible seizures at points in his life, though it's hard to diagnose retroactively with any real confidence. He was infertile, which historians widely agree was the case, based on the fact that he had 2 marriages and no children from either, which for a king whose entire job description was produce an heir to keep this whole empire from collapsing, was, to put it gently, a problem. And here's the part that always gets me, in that quiet, sad but not shocking way I promised you tonight. Nobody in the court really blamed the marriages. There's this wonderful, terrible detail that some at court believed Charles was bewitched, that his ailments were the result of a curse, and at various points exorcisms were reportedly attempted on him, actual religious rituals meant to drive out whatever evil spirit was supposedly causing his health problems. Meanwhile, of course, the actual cause was sitting quietly in the family tree the whole time, going back generation after generation, nobody willing to look at it directly, because looking at it directly would mean admitting the entire marriage strategy that built their empire was also, very slowly, unbuilding their bodies. Charles ruled, if you can call it that, for about 35 years, mostly as a figurehead, while regents and ministers actually handled the business of running Spain, because he simply wasn't equipped to do it himself. Historians sometimes call him Charles the Bewitched, which is at once a very dramatic nickname and also a very sad one, because it wasn't witchcraft, it was just biology finally sending Spain the bill for 2 centuries of very convenient royal weddings. He died in 1700 at the age of 38 without an heir, and his death didn't just end a man's life, it ended an entire dynastic line. The Spanish Habsburgs, after roughly 200 years of ruling one of the largest empires in the world, simply ran out of family to put on the throne, because the family had, in the most literal biological sense, worn itself down to nothing. His death triggered the War of the Spanish Succession, which is its own long, complicated, extremely unrelaxing topic, so we'll just gently note that it happened and drift right past it, because tonight isn't really about wars. Tonight is about the family. About cousins marrying cousins, about jaws that wouldn't close, about a sad, sickly king who was probably a genuinely gentle person, by most contemporary accounts, kind to servants, fond of his pets, quietly devout, dealt an absolutely rotten biological hand by ancestors who were, generation after generation, playing a very long, very confident game of Jenga with their own descendants' health. Let's drift back up north for a bit, gently, because the Austrian branch of the family has its own quiet oddities, even if none of them are quite as extreme as poor Charles. The Austrian Habsburgs kept doing the marrying cousins thing too, just slightly less intensely, which is sort of like saying someone drinks slightly less coffee than someone who drinks 12 cups a day. It's still a lot of coffee. There's Leopold I, for example, who ruled through the late 1600s and who also had a notably strong version of the family jaw, along with a reputation for being deeply devout, somewhat awkward socially, and very fond of music, which is a nice detail, actually, one of the more soothing ones in this story. He composed music himself, apparently with genuine skill, and supported composers at his court generously. It's nice, isn't it, picturing this jaw-heavy, socially stiff emperor finding some peace at a keyboard in the evening, away from all the marriage politics and territorial squabbles, just quietly playing music to himself in a candlelit room. Let's let him have that. Everyone in this story could use a small, peaceful moment, and Leopold's is the music room. Let's also gently mention Maria Theresa, later in the family's story, mostly because her existence is a nice reminder that not every chapter of this family is pure tragedy. Maria Theresa took the throne in the 1740s, in a genuinely difficult political moment, with much of Europe assuming a woman couldn't hold the massive, sprawling Habsburg territories together. She proved them wrong, ruling for decades, having 16 children, which is its own kind of exhausting achievement, and generally being one of the more competent, stabilizing monarchs the family produced. She also, notably, arranged marriages for her many children across pretty much every royal house in Europe, continuing the grand old family tradition, though by this point the marriages were spreading outward across Europe rather than curling tightly back in on Spain the way the earlier generations had. One of those 16 children, by the way, was a young archduchess named Marie Antonia, who would later be sent off to marry into the French royal family and become much better known to history by her French name, Marie Antoinette, which is its own long, sad, extremely well-documented story for a different quiet evening. So we'll just let that name float by for now, like a leaf on a slow river, and not chase it downstream tonight. Let's ease back toward the physical oddities for a moment, because I promised you dynastic weirdness, and I intend to deliver it gently. The Habsburg jaw wasn't the family's only calling card. There was also a persistent pattern of what doctors at the time vaguely called melancholy, which today we might describe with more specific and clinical language, but which basically amounted to a family with a notable tendency toward depression, anxiety, and emotional fragility across generations. Several Habsburg monarchs and archdukes are recorded in letters and court documents as struggling with what sound like genuine depressive episodes, long stretches of listlessness, withdrawal from court life, difficulty making decisions. Rudolf, the tragic crown prince of Austria in the later 19th century, is probably the most famous example, a man who by most accounts felt trapped by the rigid ceremonial nature of Habsburg royal life, who clashed constantly with his very traditional father Franz Joseph, and whose life ended in 1889 at a hunting lodge called Mayerling, in circumstances that were quietly, officially smoothed over by the court at the time, and are still gently debated by historians today. We won't dwell on the specifics tonight. It's not that kind of story, but it's worth noting as one more soft, sad data point in a family whose emotional lives so often seem to have been just as strained as their jaws. Let's float, very gently, toward the Empress, who might be the most quietly tragic figure in the whole later Habsburg story, because I think she deserves a peaceful little chapter here too. Empress Elisabeth of Austria, known affectionately as Sisi, married into the family as a teenager, all wide-eyed and unprepared for just how suffocating Habsburg court protocol could be. She was famously beautiful, famously restless, famously uncomfortable with the rigid formality of Viennese court life, which apparently involved rules for absolutely everything, down to how many curtsies were appropriate for which occasion. Sisi coped with this suffocating structure by becoming almost obsessively focused on her physical appearance and her freedom to travel, spending much of her later life essentially wandering Europe, visiting spas, avoiding Vienna as much as she reasonably could. She maintained an incredibly strict diet and exercise regimen that by modern standards would raise real concern, tight-lacing her corsets to keep an almost impossibly small waist well into middle age. And there are court records of her weighing herself obsessively and undertaking punishing exercise routines, patterns that today we'd recognize with real clinical concern rather than the vague admiration her contemporaries offered her for her famous beauty. She lost her only son, Rudolf, the same tragic crown prince I just mentioned, and by most accounts never really recovered from that loss, wearing black for the rest of her life and drifting even further from public and family life. It's a soft, sad little coda to a marriage that started with a bright, restless young girl who genuinely wanted more from life than the palace was built to offer her. Let's drift back down to the bodies for a moment, gently, because I did promise you the weird stuff, and I don't want to leave that thread hanging. Beyond the jaw, Habsburg portraits over the centuries show a slow, gentle drift in other features too, a notably prominent lower lip, a somewhat drooping eyelid that shows up again and again across generations, which researchers studying facial traits in royal portraiture have specifically flagged as consistent with inherited traits tied to the family's repeated intermarriage. There's actually a fairly well-known academic study published a number of years back, where researchers had specialists analyze portraits of Habsburg family members specifically for the degree of mandibular prognathism, which is the technical term for the jutting jaw, and correlate it against how inbred each individual's known family tree was. And the correlation was there, plain as day. The more inbred the family tree, the more pronounced the jaw. It's almost a little too tidy, like nature keeping very precise, very visible receipts. Let's gently drift over to some of the smaller, quirkier personal habits scattered across this family too, because dynastic weirdness isn't only about jaws and cousins. Sometimes it's just about odd little personality quirks that happen to belong to extremely powerful people. Rudolf II, Holy Roman Emperor in the late 1500s and early 1600s, is a personal favorite little detour of mine. Rudolf became increasingly reclusive as he aged, retreating into his castle in Prague and becoming utterly obsessed with alchemy, astrology, and collecting unusual objects, building what was essentially one of history's great cabinets of curiosities, full of strange minerals, exotic animals, clockwork automatons, and hired astronomers, including, at one point, genuinely, both Tycho Brahe and Johannes Kepler working at his court. Rudolf apparently found actual governing quite tedious and much preferred locking himself away with his collections and his astrologers, which again, relatable, if not exactly what you want from the guy nominally in charge of the Holy Roman Empire. He grew increasingly paranoid and withdrawn in his later years, avoiding public appearances, obsessively delaying decisions, to the point where his own family eventually had him declared incapacitated and pushed him to hand power to his brother. A quiet, slow unraveling, tucked away behind castle walls in Prague, surrounded by strange machines and stranger theories, while the actual empire ran itself as best it could without him. Let's take a gentle detour to Ferdinand I of Austria too, a 19th century emperor who is one of the more openly, tenderly acknowledged examples of how the family's repeated intermarriage caught up with them medically. Ferdinand had epilepsy, apparently fairly severe, along with some level of what contemporary accounts vaguely described as learning difficulties, and physical health struggles that meant he was never really expected, even by his own family, to rule effectively on his own. He became emperor anyway in 1835, mostly because the rules of succession simply required it, and the actual governing was handled by a council of advisors and family members working around him. Ferdinand is remembered, gently and without much cruelty by history, as a kind, harmless figure, fond of simple pleasures, famously devoted to his wife, and by most accounts perfectly content to let others handle the difficult business of running an empire while he lived a quieter, simpler life than his position technically allowed for. There's a small, sweet detail that after he abdicated in 1848, during the revolutions that swept across Europe that year, he lived out a long, peaceful retirement in Prague, reportedly telling someone, with a kind of gentle honesty, that he was perfectly happy to give up the throne, since being emperor had never really suited his temperament anyway. It's a nice, quiet ending for a man who never really asked for the job in the first place. Let's float slowly toward the very end of this long family story, because even the grandest, longest-running royal dynasty in European history eventually runs out of road. The Habsburgs, in their Austrian form, held on all the way to the First World War, with Franz Joseph I ruling for an almost impossibly long 68 years. From 1848 to 1916, a reign so long it feels less like a chapter of history and more like its own slow, steady season, stretching across generations of Europe, changing rapidly around him, while he, by most accounts, remained personally quite rigid and traditional to the very end. Franz Joseph's life was, honestly, one long accumulation of quiet personal tragedy layered under the surface of imperial formality. His son Rudolf, as mentioned, died young and troubled at Mayerling. His wife Sisi was assassinated in Geneva in 1898, stabbed by an anarchist while walking near the lake. A quiet, almost mundane death for someone who had spent so much of her life trying to escape the weight of her own royal position. And then in 1914, his heir presumptive, his nephew Franz Ferdinand, was assassinated in Sarajevo, an event which, as you probably already know from a very different kind of history video, helped tip Europe into the First World War. Franz Joseph died in 1916, in the middle of that war, an old man who had outlived nearly everyone close to him, still formally, ceremonially, exhaustingly attached to the old rules and rituals of a dynasty that was, without anyone quite saying it out loud yet, already ending. His successor, Karl I, would be the very last Habsburg to sit on the Austrian throne, ruling only briefly, from 1916 to 1918, before the empire collapsed entirely at the end of the war, and the family that had spent nearly 800 years quietly acquiring crowns through careful marriages finally, gently, without much drama at all, lost the last of them. Karl spent his remaining years in exile, first in Switzerland, then eventually on the Portuguese island of Madeira, where he died young at only 34 from pneumonia in a small rented house, a rather plain, quiet ending for the final emperor of a family that had once quite literally spanned the map of Europe. So that's where we'll gently rest tonight, floating somewhere around the edges of a dynasty finally winding down after 8 centuries. A family that built an empire out of careful weddings and slowly, unknowingly, wore its own descendants down through those same careful weddings. Jaws that wouldn't close, kings who couldn't walk until they were 4, an empress who wandered Europe trying to outrun a palace that never quite fit her, a reclusive emperor locked away with his astrologers and his strange machines, a kind, quiet man who was perfectly happy to give up being emperor once he finally got the chance. Get some rest. We'll keep floating through more of Europe's strange royal corners another night. For now, close your eyes, let the castle walls and cousin marriages drift gently out of focus, and just breathe. Hey guys, welcome back. Settle in again. Same soft pace as before, same dim lights, same slow drift through old European family trees that look less like trees and more like knots. Last time we floated through the big names, the emperors, the empresses, the jaw. Tonight we're going to ease into some of the smaller corners of this story, the side branches, the overlaps with other royal families who were frankly just as bad at avoiding their own relatives, and a few more quiet personal tragedies that tend to get skipped over in the bigger, louder histories. So get comfortable. There's no rush tonight. There never really is. Let's start by gently addressing something that probably occurred to a few of you last time, which is, why on earth did they keep doing this? Marrying cousins, marrying nieces, marrying uncles. It wasn't ignorance, exactly, and it wasn't some strange, isolated European habit either. Marrying relatives for political reasons was fairly common practice among European royalty generally. The Habsburgs were just, let's say, unusually enthusiastic about it, and unusually consistent about it, generation after generation, in a way that most other royal families eventually backed away from once the physical consequences became too obvious to ignore. The core logic was simple, almost soothing in its simplicity. If you marry outside the family, you risk diluting your claim to territory, you risk foreign influence creeping into your court, you risk your children being raised half loyal to some other kingdom's interests. If you marry within the family, none of that happens. The land stays put. The loyalty stays put. The only thing that doesn't stay put, as it turns out, is the family's physical and mental health, and that particular cost doesn't show up on a ledger. It shows up 2 or 3 generations later, in a jaw that won't close, or a child who can't walk until he's 4, and by then it's very hard to trace the invoice back to its original cause. It's a slow bill. It arrives quietly, addressed to someone who wasn't even born when the original decision was made. Let's drift toward the Bourbons for a bit, because they're a useful comparison here, gently illustrating that the Habsburgs weren't operating in a vacuum. The Bourbon family, who ruled France and later Spain as well, once the Habsburg line there finally ran dry with poor Charles II, inherited quite a lot of the same instincts. When the Bourbons took over the Spanish throne after 1700, they didn't exactly learn the obvious lesson sitting right there in front of them. They kept marrying cousins too, just slightly less intensely, spacing things out a little more, diluting the concentration just enough that the more extreme physical effects didn't stack up quite as dramatically as they had with Charles. But the pattern didn't disappear, it just softened, the way a fire doesn't go out so much, as it gets banked down for the night, still glowing quietly under the ash. There's a nice, small, sad detail from later Bourbon history involving a Spanish king named Alfonso XII, whose mother Isabella II was herself a product of some fairly close intermarriage, and whose own health struggles throughout his short life. He died at 27 from tuberculosis, were long speculated by historians to have been made worse by generations of the same old habits the family had never fully shaken. Let's ease back toward the Habsburgs proper though, because there's a specific lesser-known branch I want to gently introduce you to tonight. The Portuguese Habsburgs, sometimes called the Habsburg line, once it intersected with Habsburg blood, because Portugal's royal family did quite a lot of intermarrying with Spain's Habsburg branch too, which is part of why poor Charles II's family tree looks less like branches and more like a spiral staircase. His mother Mariana, if you remember from last time, was Philip IV's niece, but if you trace back further, you find both Spanish and Portuguese Habsburg-adjacent blood intersecting again and again, cousins marrying cousins whose own parents had been cousins, compounding quietly with each generation like interest on a loan nobody remembers taking out. One of the more overlooked figures in this Portuguese-Spanish overlap is a woman named Maria Anna of Spain, who became Holy Roman Empress by marrying Ferdinand III, and who was herself the product of yet another close Habsburg marriage. She had, by most accounts, a fairly difficult time at court, in part because of ongoing health issues that several historians have gently connected to the same broader pattern we've been discussing all evening. She died relatively young, at only 39 after complications, and while we can't say with certainty how much of that was related to family intermarriage specifically, it fits neatly, sadly, into the larger, quiet pattern this whole family seems to trace across the centuries, generation after generation of women marrying into extremely close family configurations and paying some private, personal cost for it that history barely bothered to record in detail. Because at the time, nobody thought to ask if it mattered. Let's float toward a slightly lighter corner of the story now, because I did promise you some dry humor tonight, and I don't want tonight to be entirely heavy. Let's talk about Habsburg portraiture for a moment, because it's genuinely one of the more quietly funny aspects of this whole saga. Court painters across the centuries had an extremely delicate, extremely diplomatic job when it came to painting Habsburg royals, because the honest approach, just painting exactly what was in front of them, jaw and all, occasionally got a little too honest for comfort. There are letters and records suggesting that painters were sometimes gently, diplomatically encouraged to soften certain features, and yet, and this is the funny part, they mostly didn't, or at least didn't do it very well, because if you look at Habsburg portraits across 4 centuries, the family jaw is right there, prominently displayed, generation after generation, almost defiantly unedited. It's as if court painters collectively shrugged and decided, well, everyone already knows what they look like, so what exactly am I supposed to be hiding here? There's something almost admirable about it. A family so thoroughly associated with one specific facial feature that even flattery couldn't quite talk it out of the historical record. Let's gently drift, since we are on the topic of appearances, toward Philip IV of Spain, poor Charles II's father, for a moment, because he's an interesting case of a Habsburg who seemed to have a fairly decent handle on his own family's absurdity, at least based on some of the things written about him. Philip was known to be melancholic, prone to long stretches of low mood, and quite religiously devout in a way that sometimes bordered on guilt-ridden self-punishment, apparently believing that Spain's various military setbacks during his reign were some kind of divine punishment for his own personal sins, which, if nothing else, shows a real commitment to taking things personally. He was also, somewhat famously, a significant patron of the arts, and it's under his reign that the painter Diego Velázquez did much of his most famous work, including several portraits of Philip's own children, among them a small, sickly boy named Baltasar Carlos, who was meant to be Philip's heir, painted looking bright and healthy on horseback in one of Velázquez's most famous works, and who then, quietly, sadly, died at only 16. From what's generally believed to have been smallpox, leaving Philip without a proper heir for years, until Charles finally came along, born into a family that by that point had really quite thoroughly cornered itself genetically. Let's take a slow, gentle turn now towards some of the animals and objects this family surrounded itself with, because it's a nice soft break from all the marriage talk. And honestly, royal pets and hobbies are some of the more soothing footnotes in any historical record. The Habsburgs, across various branches and centuries, kept some genuinely extensive menageries. Rudolf II, our reclusive alchemy-obsessed emperor from last time, kept lions in his castle at Prague, which is exactly the kind of detail that sounds made up but isn't. There are court records of lion keepers on the payroll, along with a whole assortment of exotic birds, and at various points, what sound like early attempts at keeping more unusual creatures like sloths and armadillos brought back from expeditions to the Americas. Animals that the Habsburg court had absolutely no practical framework for caring for properly, so one does wonder how comfortable those poor creatures actually were, tucked away in a cold Bohemian castle, very far from home. Maria Theresa, meanwhile, our capable empress from earlier, apparently had a genuine fondness for her dogs, keeping several small breeds close to her at all times, and there are charming little anecdotes of varying reliability about her allowing her dogs into formal court settings where strict protocol would normally have never permitted it. A small, gentle rebellion against all that suffocating formality that seems to run through so much of this family's story. It's nice, isn't it, imagining this famously stern, famously competent empress quietly breaking her own court's rules just so she could keep a small dog on her lap during otherwise deeply tedious state functions. Let's ease back toward the darker, sadder threads for a bit though, gently, because I did promise you the full picture tonight, and there's one more branch of this family's medical story worth mentioning, which is the sheer, staggering rate of child mortality that ran through Habsburg households across the centuries, a pattern that ties directly back to everything we discussed about intermarriage last time. Take Mariana of Austria and Philip IV, Charles II's own parents, as an example. They had several children together before Charles, and most of them died in infancy or early childhood, a pattern that repeats itself across nearly every generation of the close Spanish Habsburg marriages. Geneticists who have studied the broader pattern estimate that infant and child mortality rates within the most inbred branches of the family were considerably higher than the already quite high general rates of the era, which, given how brutal child mortality already was in early modern Europe for ordinary families, is a genuinely striking, genuinely sad statistic. It means that behind every one of these grand portraits and confident royal titles, There's usually a quiet nursery somewhere in the palace that saw far more small coffins than any family should have to bear, generation after generation, each time explained away as bad luck, or God's will, or the fragility of infants in general, never quite connected, at the time, to the increasingly narrow family tree these children had been born into. Let's drift gently sideways now, toward a related European royal family who deserves at least a soft mention here, the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria, who intermarried with the Habsburgs on multiple occasions across the centuries, and who developed, independently, their own quiet reputation for producing eccentric, troubled royal figures, most famously Ludwig II of Bavaria in the 19th century, sometimes called the Swan King, or little less kindly, Mad King Ludwig. A cousin by marriage to the Habsburg-adjacent Wittelsbach line running through Sisi, our restless empress from earlier. Ludwig became famous, and later quite notorious, for his obsessive, almost desperate devotion to romantic, fantastical architecture, building extravagant, dreamlike castles like Neuschwanstein, which, if you've ever seen pictures of it, looks almost exactly like the kind of castle you draw as a child, all soaring turrets and impossible fairy tale silhouettes, funded at ruinous personal and state expense, while Ludwig himself grew increasingly withdrawn from actual governing, preferring to retreat into his own private fantasy world of medieval romance and Wagnerian opera, a pattern that should feel a little familiar by now. Another royal man quietly retreating from the exhausting business of ruling into something softer, stranger, more personally soothing, tucked away behind castle walls of his own design. Ludwig's story ends sadly too. He was eventually declared mentally unfit to rule by a group of doctors and government officials, in circumstances that remain somewhat murky and gently debated by historians even now, and shortly afterward was found dead in a lake near one of his castles, alongside his own doctor, in a drowning that's never been fully, satisfyingly explained. One more soft, unresolved mystery drifting at the edges of this broader story of European royal families slowly, quietly coming apart at the seams behind their grand facades. Let's ease back to the main Habsburg line again, though gently, because there's one more figure from the later Austrian branch worth including tonight, Archduke Otto, sometimes called Otto the Iron Duke, or less flatteringly, Otto the Handsome, though contemporary accounts suggest that particular nickname might have been a bit generous or possibly ironic. Historians aren't entirely sure. Otto was Franz Joseph's nephew, brother to the tragic Franz Ferdinand, who we mentioned briefly at the end of last part, and Otto had, by most accounts, a genuinely wild personal life, full of scandal and reckless behavior that stood in fairly sharp contrast to the buttoned-up formality most of the family tried to project publicly. There are stories, reasonably well documented for the time, of Otto behaving disruptively in public, drinking heavily, and generally causing the kind of quiet, ongoing embarrassment that royal families tend to handle by simply not talking about it very much in official records, though of course that never stops the rumors from surviving anyway, passed along quietly through letters and diaries and whispered court gossip, the way these things always seem to survive no matter how hard anyone tries to bury them. Otto died relatively young too, at only 41, from syphilis, a fairly grim, quiet end for a man who seemed determined, in his own reckless way, to escape the same rigid Habsburg mold that so many others in this family had felt trapped inside. Let's take a slower, gentler turn now, toward the very end of our floating tonight, back to the broader shape of this whole family's story, because I think it's worth sitting with for a moment before we drift off entirely. Here's a family that spent the better part of 1,000 years accumulating land, titles, and power almost entirely through careful, calculated marriages. A strategy so effective, it briefly made them the most powerful family in the Western world, controlling territory that stretched from Spain to Austria to the Netherlands to parts of Italy and the Americas. And yet the very tool that built all of that, marriage, carefully controlled, carefully contained within the family, was also the quiet, slow-acting poison that eventually wore the whole structure down from the inside. Jaw by jaw, stillbirth by stillbirth, seizure by seizure, generation after generation, until a sickly, drooling king who couldn't produce an heir finally closed the book on the Spanish branch entirely, and a long, slow cascade of revolutions, wars, and shifting European politics eventually closed the book on the Austrian branch too, leaving behind mostly portraits, castles, and this strange, oddly specific genetic legacy that scientists still study today, centuries later, as one of history's clearest, most thoroughly documented examples of what happens when a powerful family gets just a little too comfortable keeping things close to home. And that's a good, quiet place to rest for tonight. No big dramatic ending, no shocking twist, just a slow exhale at the end of a very long, very tangled family tree. Next time, if you're still here, still cozy, still drifting, we can ease into some other corners of European royal history, other families, other quiet tragedies, other jaws that maybe didn't get quite as famous as the Habsburg one but deserve a gentle mention all the same. For now though, let the candles burn low, let your eyes close, and just let all these old castles and cousins and quiet sad kings drift gently out of focus. Good night guys, sleep well. Hey guys, welcome back again. Same gentle pace tonight, same dim room, same slow unspooling of old family secrets that were never really secrets so much as things everyone at the time politely declined to mention out loud. We've covered the big names, the big jaws, the big tragedies. Tonight let's ease into some of the smaller, softer details, the ones that don't always make it into the documentaries, and then we'll gently bring this whole long story in for a landing. Let's start with the actual science for a moment, because I mentioned last time that researchers have studied Habsburg portraits directly, and I think the details of that are worth lingering on, slowly, the way you'd linger over any good, calm bit of trivia right before bed. Back in 2019, a team of researchers, including a facial surgeon and several geneticists, published a study where they had specialists examine portraits of Habsburg family members spanning several centuries, looking specifically for the mandibular prognathism we talked about, the jutting jaw, along with a related feature called maxillary deficiency, which is basically an underdeveloped upper jaw and midface, giving that slightly sunken, concave look you sometimes see in the more extreme portraits. They also calculated inbreeding coefficients for each individual based on known genealogical records, going back generations, and cross-referenced the two. And the results were about as clean and tidy as biology ever gets. The more inbred the individual, the more pronounced the jaw, and the more pronounced the facial deficiency. It wasn't a loose correlation either. Statistically, it held up quite well, enough that the researchers felt comfortable calling it one of the clearest documented links between inbreeding and a specific physical trait in human history, mostly because the Habsburgs left behind such an unusually well-preserved paper trail, both genealogically and artistically, across such a long stretch of time. Most families don't get 400 years of oil paintings documenting their chins. The Habsburgs did, and scientists, centuries later, quietly thanked them for it. Let's drift towards some of the women of this family we haven't given quite enough time to yet. Gently, because so much of this story tends to center on the kings and emperors, when really some of the more interesting, more sympathetic threads belong to the women who were married into or born into this family and had considerably less say in any of it. Let's talk about Margaret Theresa of Spain for a little while, poor Charles II's older half-sister, who you might actually recognize without knowing it, because she's the small girl in Velázquez's famous painting Las Meninas, standing there in that enormous, elaborate dress, surrounded by her attendants, looking for all the world like a doll propped up in a dollhouse. Margaret Theresa was, by multiple accounts, a bright, lively child, and Velázquez apparently painted her with real warmth and attentiveness, but her fate followed the same old family script almost immediately. She was betrothed young to her own uncle, Leopold I, the music-loving Austrian emperor we mentioned briefly last time, and shipped off to Vienna to become his wife while still a teenager. She had several children with him, most of whom died in infancy, which by now should feel like a sadly familiar rhythm in this story, and she herself died at only 21 after childbirth complications, having spent her entire brief adult life almost immediately swallowed up by exactly the same marriage pattern that would later produce her troubled half-brother Charles. It's a strange, quiet thing, looking at that famous painting now, knowing the small, bright-eyed girl at its center had already been promised to her uncle by the time the paint had even dried. Let's ease toward another woman worth mentioning gently tonight, Infanta Maria Antonia of Spain, not to be confused with the later, more famous Marie Antoinette we mentioned last time. This Maria Antonia was Charles II's niece through his sister, and she too was married off young into the extended Habsburg network, this time to the Bavarian court, becoming Electress of Bavaria. She died young as well, at only 23, and there are records suggesting ongoing health problems throughout her short life that fit, once again, into this same broad, quiet pattern we keep circling back to. Generation after generation of young women married into or within this family, dying early, their individual causes always attributed to some specific illness or unfortunate circumstance. Never quite added up into the larger picture that modern genetics can now see so clearly from a comfortable distance. Let's take a gentle detour now into something a little lighter, because I think we've earned a soft change of pace, and that's Spanish court etiquette under the Habsburgs, which honestly deserves its own quiet chuckle, gentle as always, nothing too lively. The Spanish Habsburg court developed, over generations, some of the most extraordinarily rigid, elaborate etiquette in European history, a formal structure historians sometimes refer to as Spanish court ceremonial or etiquetta bourguignona, since it originally borrowed heavily from Burgundian court tradition. Under this system, nearly every action a monarch took during the day was governed by strict, specific protocol, dictating who could touch the king, who could speak to him first, who was permitted to hand him his shirt in the morning, quite literally. There were specific nobles whose entire job, their actual title and function at court, was to be present for the king's dressing ritual each morning, handing him garments in a precise, unchanging order. There's a small, famous, possibly slightly embellished anecdote about Philip III, an earlier Spanish Habsburg, supposedly dying of a fever brought on by sitting too close to an overheated brazier in his chambers, because the specific court official whose job it was to remove the brazier could not be located in time, and no one else was permitted by protocol to perform that task in his place. Whether that specific story is entirely accurate or has grown a little in the retelling over the centuries, it captures something very real and very true about just how suffocatingly rigid this court's formality had become. An entire elaborate structure of rules that, in its most extreme tellings, apparently valued procedure over the actual physical safety of the king. The procedures were supposedly designed to protect. Let's drift gently back to Charles II one more time, just briefly, because there's a detail about his own daily life under this same rigid system worth sitting with quietly. As an adult, deeply unwell, unable to govern effectively, Charles still had to be dressed, fed, and presented each day according to this same suffocating, centuries-old ceremonial structure. A structure built for confident, capable Habsburg kings of earlier generations, now being carried out around a man who could barely chew his food properly and who struggled to speak clearly enough to be understood. It's a strange, sad image, honestly, all that grand, elaborate Spanish court formality, all those specific nobles with their specific dressing duties, quietly continuing on, day after day, around a king who by every account needed far more actual care and far less rigid ceremony than the system around him was built to provide. Let's ease toward closing this whole long story now. Gently, the way we always do, no big dramatic finish, just a slow settling down. If there's one thread worth pulling together from everything we've covered across these 3 long, slow parts, it's this. The Habsburgs built one of history's largest, longest-lasting empires almost entirely through careful, patient, calculated marriage, a strategy so effective that for a while it genuinely seemed like the smartest, safest possible way to hold on to power in a chaotic, war-torn continent. And it worked for centuries, right up until it very quietly, very slowly stopped working. Not through some dramatic single failure, but through the gradual, compounding cost of using that same tool over and over on an increasingly small, increasingly closed circle of people. A jaw that got heavier each generation. A rate of infant mortality that quietly climbed higher than it should have. A king who couldn't walk until 4, couldn't speak clearly his whole life, and couldn't produce the heir his entire elaborate court structure existed to eventually welcome. It's not really a villain story, and it's not really a story with a single moment you can point to and say, there, that's where it went wrong. It's slower than that, and sadder than that, in a quiet, unhurried way that I think suits the hour, wherever you are right now, listening to this with your eyes probably starting to feel heavy, so let's leave it there for tonight. 1,000 years, give or take, of careful weddings and quiet consequences, of reclusive emperors surrounded by lions and astrologers, of empresses fleeing suffocating palace protocol by wandering Europe alone, of small bright-eyed girls in enormous painted dresses already promised to uncles they hadn't met yet, of a family motto about happy Austria marrying its way to power without quite realizing, for centuries, exactly what bill it was quietly running up in the process. Thanks for floating through all of this with me tonight and over the past few parts. Get some rest now. Let the candles go out, let the old castles fade from view, and just breathe slowly and know that somewhere centuries ago a whole family of tired, jaw-heavy royals were probably just as ready for bed as you are right now. Good night, guys. Hey guys, back again. Same soft room, same slow pace, same gentle unwinding of old royal secrets. We thought we might be done with the Habsburgs, and mostly we are, but there's always another quiet corner to drift into with a family this old and this thoroughly documented. So tonight, let's ease into a few threads we haven't quite pulled yet, some further back in time, some spreading outward into other families this bloodline touched. No rush. Let's just keep floating. Let's go back, gently, further than we have before, to the early 16th century, to a fellow named Ferdinand I, Charles V's younger brother, who ended up inheriting Austria and eventually Hungary and Bohemia too, through, of course, another marriage, this time to Anne of Bohemia and Hungary, whose own brother conveniently died young in battle, leaving those crowns to fall rather neatly into Habsburg hands. Ferdinand himself doesn't get talked about nearly as much as his more famous brother Charles, and honestly, that tracks, because Ferdinand was by most accounts a steady, unglamorous administrator, competent without being especially colorful, the kind of historical figure who quietly does the actual work of running an empire, while his more famous relative gets all the portraits and the poetry. It's worth pausing on him for a moment simply because he represents something this family did fairly often and rarely gets credit for, which is a kind of patient, boring competence, sitting quietly underneath all the more dramatic jaw-related tragedy we've spent the last few nights on. Not every Habsburg was sickly or reclusive or heartbroken. Some of them were just fine, actually reasonably healthy, reasonably capable, just slightly less interesting to talk about at 1 in the morning. Let's drift toward Ferdinand's own children for a moment though, because even the steady, boring branches of this family eventually curl back toward the familiar pattern. One of his daughters, Joanna of Austria, was married off to her own first cousin, Infante John of Portugal, continuing that same old Habsburg instinct for keeping things close. Joanna gave birth to a son, the future King Sebastian of Portugal, and then almost immediately became a widow, her young husband dying before their child was even born. Sebastian grew up without a father, raised in a court obsessed, in that particular Iberian 16th century way, with religious destiny and crusading glory, and as a young man he became fixated on the idea of leading a grand military campaign into North Africa, against the advice of pretty much everyone around him who had any actual military sense. He went anyway at only 24 and died in battle at Alcácer-Quibia in 1578, leaving no heir, which, in the grand old Habsburg tradition, meant that Portugal's crown ended up passing, through a fairly complicated succession dispute, into the hands of his great uncle, who happened to be Philip II of Spain, folding Portugal briefly into the Spanish Habsburg orbit for the next 60 years. It's a strange little sidebar, isn't it, how a young king's stubborn desire for glory ends up, several steps removed, just handing more territory to his own extended family anyway, almost as if the family motto about letting others wage war while Habsburgs marry was quietly operating in the background the whole time, even when someone actually did go to war. Let's ease sideways now, gently, toward the broader European royal marriage network this whole family helped create, because by the 18th and 19th centuries, the Habsburgs weren't marrying quite so intensely within their own immediate bloodline anymore, the Spanish branch having already demonstrated rather thoroughly where that road led. Instead, the family started marrying outward into other royal houses, spreading the same old instincts a little more thinly across the continent, which is really how you end up with families like the Coburgs, later Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, becoming this quiet, sprawling web connecting nearly every throne in Europe by the late 1800s. Queen Victoria of Britain, for instance, married her own first cousin, Albert of Saxe-Coburg and Gotha, a marriage arranged in part through connections tracing back through this same broad web of interrelated royal houses that the Habsburgs had spent centuries helping to knit together. And Victoria and Albert's own children carried something along with them into nearly every royal house in Europe that historians have spent a great deal of time studying since. A mutation causing hemophilia, a blood-clotting disorder, which several of Victoria's descendants passed down into the royal families of Russia, Spain, and Germany, most famously into the Russian imperial family through Victoria's granddaughter Alexandra, whose own son, the young Tsarevich Alexei, suffered from the condition throughout his short, fragile childhood, an entirely different genetic thread than the Habsburg jaw, but cut from the very same cloth of a European royal culture that kept marrying its own relatives generation after generation and kept being quietly, sadly surprised each time the consequences showed up in the nursery. Let's drift back toward Austria one more time, though, gently, because there's a smaller, softer Habsburg figure from the 19th century worth, including, before we finish up tonight, Archduchess Sophie, mother to Franz Joseph, the long-reigning emperor from our first evening together. Sophie was, by most accounts, an intensely strong-willed, controlling woman, deeply devoted to preserving Habsburg tradition and formality, and she's often quietly blamed by historians for much of the friction that later developed between Franz Joseph and his own son Rudolf, having raised her son Franz Joseph with an extremely rigid, disciplined sense of duty that he then, in turn, imposed just as rigidly on his own children. There's a small, sad irony there worth sitting with for a moment. A mother so determined to protect and preserve the family's traditions and formality that she may have quietly helped set in motion the very emotional distance and rigidity that later contributed to her own grandson's troubled, tragic end at Mayerling. It's not dramatic. It's just one of those slow, generational patterns that families sometimes pass down without ever quite meaning to. Tradition curdling gently into distance, discipline curdling gently into loneliness, one gentle, well-intentioned decision at a time. Let's ease now slowly toward actually closing this whole long story for good, because I think we've drifted through about as much of this family as makes sense for one long, quiet series of nights together. Let's just take a moment, gently, to hold the whole shape of it. A little castle in the Swiss hills called Hawk Castle that gave a minor noble family its name. A motto about letting others fight wars while Habsburgs simply married their way to power. Centuries of careful, calculated weddings that built an empire spanning from Spain to Austria to the Netherlands to the Americas. And running alongside all of that success, quietly, patiently, for generation after generation, a slow, gentle accumulation of cost that nobody at the time had the scientific tools to properly see, showing up instead in jaws that wouldn't close, in children who died before their first birthday, in kings who couldn't speak clearly enough to be understood by their own court, in restless empresses fleeing suffocating palace walls, in reclusive emperors hiding behind astrologers and pet lions, in a young king riding off toward a battle nobody thought he should fight, in a mother's rigid discipline echoing sadly down through her own grandson's short, troubled life. It's not a story with villains, really. It's just a very long, very slow demonstration of what happens when a family gets extremely good at one particular strategy and simply never stops to ask what it might be quietly costing them, generation after generation, until the bill finally comes due in the shape of a king who can't produce an heir, and an empire that, after 800 years, finally, quietly, runs out of road. Thanks for spending these long, slow nights with me, drifting through castles and cousins and quiet royal sadness. If you're still awake right now, well, that's probably on me, not you. Let your eyes close, let the last of these old family portraits fade gently out of view, and just rest. Good night, guys. We'll find another quiet corner of history to drift through again soon. Hey guys, welcome back one more time. We've said goodnight to this family twice now, and yet here we are again, which honestly feels very on brand for a family that just could not seem to let go of anything either. Let's use this last stretch gently, tying off a few loose threads, and then we'll properly close the book on the Habsburgs for good. Let's talk softly about what actually happened to all those portraits and castles once the family finally lost its thrones. Most of the Habsburg-Lorraine descendants, after the empire dissolved in 1918, simply became private citizens, which must have been an extraordinarily strange adjustment after generations of being raised from birth to believe their families' marriages quite literally shaped the map of Europe. Karl's widow, Empress Zita, lived on for decades after his early death in Madeira, remarkably into 1989, actually old enough to see the Berlin Wall fall, old enough to watch the entire political order her family had once anchored disappear and reshape itself completely without a single Habsburg on any throne anywhere. She raised her children in exile, moving between various countries in Europe and eventually North America during the Second World War, quietly keeping old court customs alive in small, private ways, insisting on certain formalities at the dinner table, even in modest rented houses. A small, gentle echo of all that old Spanish court ceremonial we talked about, still lingering on in miniature, long after the empire it once served had gone. Her eldest son, Otto von Habsburg, is actually a nice, quiet, fairly happy note to end on, all things considered. He lived to be nearly 99, spent much of his adult life as a genuine advocate for European unity, eventually serving for years as an elected member of the European Parliament, which is a strange, soft little twist, isn't it? The eldest son of the last Habsburg emperor spending his later career helping build the very kind of peaceful, cooperative European structure that made the old model of empire by marriage completely unnecessary. He died in 2011, and his funeral in Vienna still followed centuries-old Habsburg funeral tradition, including the old ceremonial knocking on the door of the Capuchin crypt, where generations of Habsburgs are buried, a monk on the other side asking who seeks entry, and the answer given being not his name and titles, but simply a mortal, sinful man. It's a small, humbling little ritual to end on, honestly, this enormous, sprawling, jaw-heavy dynasty, and in the end, the door only opens for a mortal, sinful man, same as anyone else. And that gently is where we'll finally leave the Habsburgs, resting quietly in that crypt in Vienna, done with thrones, done with marriages, done with all of it. Thanks for staying with me through this whole long, slow story. If you'd like, next time we can drift into an entirely different corner of history, another dynasty, another family, another set of quiet royal oddities. For now, let it all go. Good night, guys. Hey guys, quick gentle pause here. We actually tucked the Habsburgs into bed for good in that last part, crypt door and all, so there isn't more of their story left to drift through without just repeating myself, and I don't want to do that to you. If you want to keep floating tonight, I can start fresh on a new topic in this exact same slow, sleepy style. A few options, pick whichever sounds most soothing. The Romanovs, Russia's last royal family, hemophilia, and a very slow motion collapse the Braganzas, Portugal and Brazil's odd, overlooked royal branch, sad, sickly and spoiled. A broader guide to medieval royal children across several families, the Wittelsbachs of Bavaria, Mad King Ludwig and his relatives. In full, just let me know which one, or tell me to surprise you. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight we're continuing our slow journey through the strange and sleepy world of Europe's most feared royal inbred family. At this point in our story, the Habsburg dynasty has accumulated enough titles, kingdoms, crowns and relatives to confuse almost everyone involved. And perhaps that is the perfect place to begin. Because if you walked into a major Habsburg palace during the 17th century, you would find yourself surrounded by family, an astonishing amount of family. Not the pleasant sort who visit once a year and bring a pie, no, these relatives were everywhere, at court, at dinner, in government, in military commands, in marriage negotiations, and very often in marriage contracts themselves. The Habsburgs had spent centuries building an empire through carefully arranged weddings. The strategy had worked beautifully in terms of territory. Genetically, however, things were becoming a little more complicated, actually considerably more complicated. A modern genealogist examining some branches of the family tree might quietly reach for aspirin. A few minutes later, they might reach for a second aspirin, because tracing Habsburg family relationships can feel like following a maze designed by someone who fundamentally misunderstood the purpose of family trees. Normally, a family tree spreads outward. The Habsburg version often seemed determined to fold back into itself. Branches met other branches. Cousins married cousins. Uncles married nieces. And the same ancestors appeared repeatedly, again and again and again, like recurring guest stars who refused to leave the stage. Of course, nobody at court thought this was particularly strange. For them, preserving dynastic power remained the highest priority. The goal was stability, keep wealth within the family, keep influence within the family, keep crowns within the family, keep everything within the family. The word outside was apparently becoming unpopular. Now imagine being a young Habsburg prince. From birth, your future is already mapped out. You do not choose your profession. You do not choose your spouse. You do not choose where you live. You barely choose what you eat. Entire committees of nobles may have opinions about your breakfast. Your existence is essentially a political project, a very expensive political project. People study your health, your education, your habits, your personality, your potential marriage prospects, and every conversation eventually returns to the same topic. The dynasty, always the dynasty. A prince might want to spend his day hunting. The court wants to discuss succession. A princess might want to learn music. The court wants to discuss alliances. Everyone has hobbies. The dynasty has paperwork, and somehow the paperwork usually wins. This created a peculiar atmosphere inside royal courts. Everything felt formal. Every action carried meaning. Even a simple dinner could become an elaborate political performance. Guests watched one another carefully. Servants followed strict procedures. Etiquette governed nearly everything. How to stand, how to sit, how to speak, how to bow, how close to stand near a monarch, how far away to stand from a monarch, and probably how dramatically to avoid standing in the wrong place. Court life could be exhausting, even for the people who created the rules, especially for the people who created the rules. Meanwhile, ordinary Europeans often imagined royal life as a continuous festival of luxury. And to be fair, there was plenty of luxury: enormous banquets, beautiful clothing, lavish ceremonies, magnificent architecture, paintings, jewels, music, gold decorations seemingly attached to every available surface. If a wall existed long enough, somebody probably attempted to cover it with something expensive. Yet beneath the glittering surface existed constant anxiety. Every royal family feared instability. Every dynasty worried about heirs. Every ruler worried about succession. And the Habsburgs worried perhaps more than most, because succession was becoming increasingly delicate. The dynasty had grown so interconnected that a single death could trigger political complications stretching across half of Europe. One prince dies, 3 kingdoms become nervous, 4 ambassadors begin writing urgent letters, 5 royal cousins suddenly acquire unexpected claims, and 6 historians later spend centuries explaining what happened. Sometimes history feels like a very complicated inheritance dispute. Now let's drift quietly into another corner of palace life: education. Royal children received extensive instruction: languages, religion, history, politics, military theory, diplomacy, court etiquette. A future ruler needed broad knowledge, or at least enough knowledge to appear confident while other people solved problems. This was a surprisingly common royal strategy. Not every monarch was brilliant. Some were, some absolutely were not. History contains examples of both, and plenty somewhere in between, yet even talented rulers faced challenges. The Habsburg Empire had become enormous. Managing such a vast collection of territories required endless attention: different languages, different cultures, different laws, different traditions. A ruler might spend half a day discussing taxation in one region, then another half discussing religious disputes somewhere else, then finish the evening reviewing diplomatic reports. Being king often involved significantly more paperwork than medieval paintings suggest. Paintings rarely show monarchs reading tax reports. Apparently, artists preferred dramatic poses, which is understandable. Few people commission portraits titled, "His Majesty examines agricultural revenue figures." Though honestly, that would be refreshingly accurate. Meanwhile, the dynasty's famous physical characteristics continued becoming more noticeable. Generations of intermarriage left visible marks. The famous jaw remained present. Facial structures became increasingly similar. Court artists attempted to be diplomatic. Naturally, royal patrons generally preferred flattering portraits. This created a delicate challenge. How do you paint someone realistically while also ensuring continued employment? Many artists solved this problem through careful creativity. A slightly softer angle here, a more flattering pose there. Strategic lighting became very important, extremely important. Possibly career-savingly important, yet even artistic diplomacy had limits. Reality occasionally remained visible. Centuries later, historians would compare portraits and identify striking patterns. The dynasty's appearance had become unusually consistent, which sounds impressive until you remember the reason. And then it sounds somewhat less impressive. Still, life continued, ceremonies continued, marriages continued, politics continued. The machine of dynasty rolled onward, generation after generation. One of the most fascinating aspects of royal history is how normal, extraordinary circumstances can seem to the people living through them. Imagine explaining the Habsburg family tree to a modern person. The average listener might respond with several minutes of concerned silence, perhaps followed by, "Wait, they're related how?" But for contemporary nobles, these arrangements often seemed entirely reasonable. Tradition carries remarkable power. People become accustomed to almost anything if it persists long enough, even family relationships that resemble advanced geometry. As evening settles over the palace, candles flicker along vast corridors, servants move quietly through the halls. Somewhere a diplomat drafts another letter, somewhere a prince studies his lessons, somewhere a noble family discusses yet another marriage proposal, and somewhere, inevitably, two distant relatives discover they are actually much less distant than previously believed. The Habsburg world remains calm, orderly, ceremonial, and quietly strange, very strange. Yet perhaps that is why their story remains so fascinating centuries later, because it combines immense power with deeply human flaws, ambition, fear, pride, tradition, the desire to preserve what one already possesses. Again and again, these forces shape decisions, and those decisions shape generations. The dynasty continued seeking stability, continued protecting its position, continued trusting methods that had once brought extraordinary success, even as hidden costs accumulated beneath the surface, costs that would eventually become impossible to ignore. But that part of the story still lies ahead. For now, the palace sleeps, the corridors grow quieter, the candles burn lower, and Europe's most famous dynasty continues drifting through another peaceful evening, surrounded by crowns, ceremony, and an almost unimaginable number of relatives. A truly remarkable number of relatives, and as our sleepy journey continues, we'll soon discover how these generations of decisions slowly carried the family toward challenges no amount of royal tradition could easily solve. But that is a story for the next part. For tonight, rest easy. The palace remains calm. The empire still stands. And the Habsburg family tree continues doing whatever it is that Habsburg family trees do, which as usual is becoming more complicated with every passing generation. Part 8. A dynasty trapped by its own success. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, we're going to continue our gentle wander through the curious world of the Habsburgs. By now, this family has accumulated enough kingdoms, duchies, counties, titles, castles, and relatives to fill several libraries. And honestly, they probably did. If there was one thing early modern governments loved, it was paperwork. If there were two things they loved, it was paperwork and more paperwork. And the Habsburg Empire generated mountains of it: letters, treaties, marriage contracts, tax records, diplomatic reports, inheritance documents, and endless discussions about who should marry whom. The answer, rather predictably, was often another Habsburg, which was becoming less of a strategy and more of a habit, a very old habit, a habit with consequences. But for now, let's stroll through the empire during one of its seemingly stable periods. From a distance, everything looked impressive, magnificent. Even the Habsburgs ruled enormous territories. Their influence stretched across Europe. Their courts glittered with wealth. Their armies commanded respect. Their diplomats negotiated with kings. Their portraits hung in grand halls. Their family name inspired admiration and concern in equal measure. Not bad for a dynasty that had started with a castle in Switzerland centuries earlier. Yet success can be surprisingly deceptive, because stability and strength are not always the same thing. A building can look magnificent from the outside while quietly developing cracks underneath. The Habsburgs were discovering something similar, slowly, very slowly, the kind of slowly that takes several generations to notice. One of the strange things about royal dynasties is that they often become prisoners of their own traditions. Practice works once, then it works twice. Then it works for 100 years. Soon nobody remembers why it started. They simply continue doing it, because that is how things are done. The Habsburg marriage strategy had delivered extraordinary results, so naturally they trusted it. Why wouldn't they? From their perspective, the evidence seemed overwhelming. Marriage had brought kingdoms. Marriage had brought alliances. Marriage had brought power. Marriage had built an empire. Unfortunately, genetics was keeping its own records. And genetics tends to be less impressed by political achievements. Nature does not care how many crowns your ancestors wore. Nature does not care how many treaties were signed. Nature does not care how beautiful your palace happens to be. Nature simply continues following its rules, patiently, quietly, for generation after generation. And eventually those rules began making themselves known, not all at once. That would be too dramatic. History rarely operates with perfect timing. Instead, problems emerged gradually. Some family members experienced health difficulties. Others struggled to produce heirs. Some children died young. Some never enjoyed robust health. At first, these incidents appeared isolated. Then patterns began emerging. Then the patterns became harder to ignore, of course. Nobody wanted to talk about this openly. Royal courts rarely enjoyed uncomfortable conversations, especially conversations suggesting that centuries of dynastic policy might have been a mistake. That sort of discussion tends to make dinner parties awkward. Imagine the scene. A noble cautiously suggests that perhaps marrying relatives repeatedly may not be ideal. The room suddenly becomes very interested in its soup. Someone changes the subject to architecture. Another person compliments a painting. A third person begins discussing weather patterns, anything but that topic. Yet reality continued moving forward regardless, and reality can be remarkably persistent. Meanwhile, daily court life remained full of rituals. The Habsburg world loved ceremonies, loved them. Births required ceremonies, marriages required ceremonies, religious festivals required ceremonies, diplomatic visits required ceremonies. Simply entering certain rooms sometimes required enough etiquette to qualify as a small ceremony. Everything had rules, detailed rules, complicated rules, rules about other rules. If someone sneezed in the wrong direction, there was probably a protocol for it. Modern people occasionally imagine that royal life was carefree, endless luxury, endless comfort, endless entertainment. In truth, many nobles spent their lives navigating an ocean of expectations. Every movement mattered, every word mattered, every appearance mattered, especially appearances, because rulers represented more than themselves. They represented the dynasty, the state, the crown, sometimes even divine authority. No pressure, just the weight of an empire resting on your shoulders before breakfast. Yet despite these burdens, court life could also be surprisingly ordinary. Princes studied lessons, noble children played games, courtiers gossiped, people complained about the weather, people worried about money, even very wealthy people somehow managed to worry about money. Human nature remains remarkably consistent. Centuries change, technology changes, fashion changes. Yet people remain people. They worry, they hope, they complain, they make questionable decisions. The Habsburgs simply conducted these activities while wearing significantly more velvet. Now let's drift into one of the dynasty's most fascinating contradictions. The Habsburgs genuinely believed they were protecting their family. Every marriage arrangement was designed to preserve strength, preserve territory, preserve influence, preserve stability. Their intentions often seemed logical within their own political world. Yet the very measures intended to secure the dynasty were gradually undermining it. This is one of history's favorite ironies. People often create the conditions they hope to avoid. The more the dynasty tried to protect itself, the more vulnerable certain aspects became. Nobody planned this. Nobody gathered together and proposed weakening future generations. Quite the opposite. Everyone believed they were acting responsibly, sensibly, prudently, which somehow makes the outcome even more fascinating. because history is full of villains. But it is also full of ordinary people making reasonable decisions that slowly lead somewhere unexpected. The Habsburg story belongs firmly in that second category, and perhaps that is why it remains so compelling. It feels deeply human, not despite its crowns and palaces. Because of them, beneath the royal titles were people, people constrained by tradition, people shaped by expectations, people trying to preserve what previous generations had built. People who rarely saw the full consequences of their choices. No one lives with the benefit of hindsight. Historians receive hindsight. The people inside history do not. They simply continue forward, one day at a time, one marriage at a time, one generation at a time. As evening settles across the empire, candles glow in palace windows, courtiers finish their conversations, ambassadors complete their reports, servants prepare chambers for the night. Somewhere another young prince dreams about the future. Somewhere another marriage negotiation quietly begins. Somewhere another decision is made in the name of preserving the dynasty. And the dynasty continues onward, powerful, prestigious, admired, feared, and increasingly trapped within the very system that created its greatness. A system built over centuries, a system nobody fully understood, a system that would soon face its greatest test. But that story awaits us in the next part. For now, the palace grows quiet, the corridors empty, the candles burn lower. And Europe's most famous royal family drifts peacefully into another night, unaware that history is slowly approaching one of its most extraordinary turning points. Hey guys, welcome back. Tonight, as the palace settles into silence once again, we're going to continue our slow journey through the world of the Habsburgs. By now, generations have come and gone, kings have ruled, queens have negotiated, princes have studied, courtiers have gossiped. And somewhere in the background, countless family portraits have quietly watched everything unfold. If Habsburg portraits could talk, they would probably spend most of their time trying to explain how everyone was related. And even then, they might get confused halfway through, because the dynasty had reached a point where family relationships were becoming astonishingly complicated. Not intentionally, at least not entirely. It was simply the result of centuries of repeating the same strategy. Keep power within the family, keep lands within the family, keep crowns within the family, keep absolutely everything within the family if possible. From a political perspective, it often seemed sensible. From a genealogical perspective, things were becoming creative, very creative. The interesting thing about powerful dynasties is that they often become obsessed with continuity. Every ruler wants to be remembered. Every ruler wants stability. Every ruler hopes future generations will preserve what has been built. The Habsburgs were no different. In fact, they may have pursued continuity more aggressively than almost any dynasty in European history. And for a long time it worked. That is what makes this story so fascinating. The strategy was not immediately disastrous. Quite the opposite. It produced centuries of success, vast territories, immense influence, extraordinary wealth, international prestige. When something delivers results for generations, people naturally trust it. Why would they stop? From their perspective, the evidence seemed obvious. The dynasty remained powerful, the empire remained enormous, the palaces remained full, the treasury still functioned, the crown still glittered, everything appeared stable, at least from a distance. But distance can hide many things. Let's imagine a traveler arriving at a Habsburg court. The first impression would be overwhelming. Magnificent architecture, grand staircases, golden decorations, paintings stretching across enormous halls, musicians performing elegant pieces, servants moving quietly through endless corridors. Everything designed to communicate one message: power, not subtle power, not modest power, very obvious power, the kind of power that wants visitors to leave saying, well, that was certainly impressive. And visitors usually did. Yet beneath this impressive exterior, concerns quietly persisted. Succession remained a constant worry. Health remained a constant worry. The future remained a constant worry, because dynasties, no matter how wealthy, always depend on one fragile thing: the next generation. Without heirs, everything becomes uncertain. Titles become disputed. Territories become contested. Alliances become unstable. Ambitious neighbors suddenly develop new ideas. And European history contains no shortage of ambitious neighbors. There was always another ruler somewhere looking at a map and thinking, that border could be adjusted, usually in their favor. Naturally, the Habsburgs understood this better than anyone, which is why producing heirs remained one of the dynasty's central concerns. A prince was not simply a child. A prince represented continuity, security, political stability, the future itself. That is a tremendous amount of responsibility for someone who has not yet learned multiplication. Royal childhood was strange in many ways. Young princes and princesses lived lives surrounded by privilege. Yet they also lived under extraordinary scrutiny. Tutors monitored education. Advisors monitored behavior. Courtiers observed development. Relatives discussed future marriages. Everyone seemed interested in their future, sometimes before the child was old enough to understand the conversation. Imagine being 10 years old and discovering that several kingdoms have opinions about your eventual wedding. Not exactly a normal childhood experience. Still, many royal children adapted. They studied languages, learned court etiquette, practiced diplomacy, received religious instruction, prepared for responsibilities awaiting them. Some excelled, others did not. Human beings remain wonderfully unpredictable regardless of social status. A crown cannot guarantee talent. History repeatedly demonstrates this fact. And the Habsburgs experienced their share of brilliant rulers and less brilliant rulers. Some were energetic reformers. Some were capable administrators. Some were intelligent diplomats. And some appeared to spend much of their reign looking tired, which, to be fair, may have been an entirely reasonable reaction to governing a multinational empire. Running enormous territories is exhausting, even before breakfast. Now let's slowly wander into another fascinating aspect of Habsburg life: their relationship with tradition. Tradition shaped everything: court ceremonies, religious practices, political customs, marriage arrangements, public appearances, even daily routines. The dynasty inherited centuries of habits and expectations, and once traditions become established, they can acquire remarkable momentum. People stop asking why, they simply continue, because that is how things have always been done. This mindset can create stability. It can also create blindness, sometimes both at the same time. The Habsburg marriage tradition illustrates this perfectly. What began as a successful political strategy eventually became a deeply rooted assumption, a default solution, a familiar answer. The dynasty trusted what had worked before again and again and again. Meanwhile, generations passed, and the genetic consequences continued accumulating quietly in the background, like a slow-moving storm beyond the horizon. Not dramatic, not immediate, just persistent, year after year, decade after decade, century after century. One of the remarkable things about history is how gradual major changes often appear. Modern people sometimes expect dramatic turning points, lightning bolts, declarations, sudden transformations. Real life rarely behaves so neatly. Most historical developments unfold slowly, so slowly that people living through them barely notice. The Habsburg story follows this pattern. No single moment created the problem. No single marriage caused it. No single ruler recognized the full scale of what was happening. Instead, countless small decisions accumulated over generations, each one understandable, each one reasonable within its context, each one contributing something to the future. And eventually the future arrived, though not quite yet. For now our dynasty continues forward, the empire still functions, the palaces remain busy, diplomats still negotiate, princes still study, nobles still attend ceremonies, and artists still paint portraits of remarkably familiar-looking relatives. Very familiar-looking relatives. As evening settles across Europe once again, candles flicker in distant windows. A court musician plays softly somewhere in a palace chamber. A secretary finishes another letter. An ambassador prepares another report. And the great Habsburg machine continues turning, steadily, predictably, almost peacefully. Yet hidden beneath this calm surface, the accumulated weight of generations is becoming impossible to ignore. The choices of fathers affect sons. The choices of grandfathers affect grandchildren, and the choices of centuries eventually affect entire dynasties. That reality is slowly approaching. The long shadow of the ancestors is stretching farther with every passing year, and soon that shadow will fall across the future of the entire family. But that story belongs to the next part. For tonight, rest comfortably. The palace remains quiet. The empire still endures. And the Habsburgs continue drifting through history, carrying with them all the triumphs, traditions, and complications inherited from generations long gone.